All right, welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast, week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson, and I am joined yet again by Mr. Dave Holland. How are you doing today?
Yeah, not too bad, Craig. Thanks again for letting me to come on your show. So it's an honor, and it's always good to talk about Guadalcanal.
And for those who probably haven't seen the first episode, do you want to say just a little bit about yourself before we begin?
Yes, I'm currently living in Australia. Well, I'm permanently living in Australia, but I'm originally from the US. I was in US Marines for 8 years. And due to my work with the Australian government, I got to live on Guadalcanal for a number of years. I left there recently in 2020. And I'm waiting to go back, but during my time there, I walked the battlefields quite a lot. Did a lot of research and filmed my adventures and travel, so to speak. And I led a lot of tour groups when I was there. So, yeah, so I've been studying Guadalcanal for a number of years now.
And you have quite an interesting YouTube channel. I don't think many people do exactly what you do. You want to go and say a little bit more about that?
Oh, yes. My YouTube channel is called Guadalcanal, Walking a Battlefield. Also have a accompanying, I guess you could say, Facebook channel or Facebook page called the same, Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield. So my videos I made for people who would never actually go to the battlefield itself, or those who went on the week-long tour groups and didn't go off the beaten path, so to speak, and stay to the itinerary. And it allowed me to drill down deep into some little known areas of the battlefield. So I made those for the people who would never ever get a chance to go there, or very reluctantly, and didn't hit the main spots. So also to my Facebook page, I probably update it every 1 or 2 days. I try to put original source material on there, stuff that you probably never see on other sites, and a lot of then and now photos too. So a lot of good Guadalcanal information on there.
Excellent. And just to tell members of the audience who may have not have seen the, well, I guess we'll call it the first part of this two-parter, we'll call it. You had started to explain to us exactly what Operation Watchtower or Guadalcanal Campaign exactly was, why we even have a Guadalcanal Campaign. And you went into great depth about the Battle of Alligator Creek and the Battle of Edson's Ridge. And that's pretty much where we left off, but there's a lot more to the story, as, well, we both know. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know I now have a Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there you can find exclusive Patreon episodes and podcasts based on suggestions from patrons, and other benefits like early access to all of my content, live hangouts, your name in the end credits, and much, much more. So please go check it out.
Yeah, there's a lot more to the Guadalcanal campaign. I mean, it's a 6-month long campaign, and you can make a lot of mini series, so to speak, out of it. Focusing on the air, land, and naval engagements. Such a large aspect in the war. It played a major part in the Pacific War. So I'll mainly speak about the land campaign. I will, I guess, touch base a little bit on the naval parts of it when it's very relevant to the land campaign. And you got to remember, during all this I'm talking today, there was up in the air, there was ongoing air battles at the same time. So yeah, it had it all Guadalcanal. So basically at our last podcast, we ended up at the Battle of Bloody Ridge, which is, I think we ended up on the 15th of September. So that last week or two in September is quite important in the Guadalcanal campaign for the Marines and for the Japanese. So for the Japanese, after the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Japanese High Command had an emergency meeting. And at the same time, the Japanese, they were fighting on Guadalcanal. At the same time, they were fighting in Papua New Guinea over the Kokoda tract. They had landed at Bunangona in the northeast part of Papua New Guinea, and they were attacking over the tract toward Port Moresby to take Port Moresby. So that was that campaign was full and running at the same time. So that was their main objective in the Southwest, the South Pacific, was Port Moresby. So after Kawagachi in the 35th Brigade was defeated at Bloody Ridge, the Japanese High Command decided, okay, what we'll do is we'll make Guadalcanal our main effort. So we can't run two efforts at the same time with PNG and Guadalcanal. So Guadalcanal will be our main effort. We will orders was issued to the South Seas Detachment at the time. So they were the Japanese fighting on the Dakota Track, to cease all offensive operations, to basically hold in place and await for further reinforcements and limited amount of supply once Guadalcanal was handled. So all the reinforcements and all the major supply was sent into Guadalcanal. So that was a major turning point, especially for the Australians who were fighting in PNG, the Battle of Bloody Ridge. It also, for the Marines, at the same time on September the 18th, was their first big resupply. I mean, that had limited resupplies by fast transports and some small destroyers, so to speak, to unload limited amount of supplies. Because I think, if you remember, we spoke about in the last podcast, after the U.S. Navy pulled out on the 9th of August, the Marines were left roughly for about 2 weeks with hardly any supply at all, just what they landed with. But this September the 18th arrival, there's a lot of supplies on there, and also, more importantly, was the 7th Marine Regiment, or the 7th Marines, as the Marines called them. So they arrived with a battery of artillery and also a company of tanks. It was roughly about 4,000 Marines. These guys, the 7th Marines, were a part of the 1st Marine Division, because the division has 3 regiments, 3 infantry regiments and an artillery regiment. The 7th Marines, at the beginning of the war, when the Japanese were attacking to the South Pacific, like Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia was I guess, threatened. So what the Americans did, they sent a number of troops out to garrison these islands. And one of the islands they garrisoned was Samoa. So they sent the 7th Marines out. So they fleshed out the regiment with some of the best NCOs and officers, the best equipment they had at the time, attached a battalion of artillery to them and a company of tanks, and sent them to Samoa. And they were known as the 3rd Marine Provisional Brigade. So they thought they were going to be the first ones to fight, but ironically, the 1st Marine Division landed on the 7th of August in Guadalcanal without them. So some of the 7th Marines had some of the legends in the Marine Corps, especially legends of Guadalcanal later, such as Chesty Puller, H.H. Hannikin, Mitchell Page, John Basilone, a lot of senior NCOs and officers in there. So they were considered like a very crack unit, so to speak. So Vandergriff, the division commander, was very happy, and these guys are very well welcomed. So they arrived, and that allowed Vandergriff to form a 360-degree perimeter, where before, if you remember, when we spoke about last podcast, they had a horseshoe-shaped perimeter, and he couldn't really man their southern line, so to speak, because the main threats were to the front and to the flanks. And that's when the Japanese attacked on Bloody Ridge. But so that allowed him to form a 360-degree, but also allowed 360-degree perimeter, but also allowed the Marines to have a fresh unit to conduct some limited offensive operations to try to go after the Japanese to push them back. Also, at the same time, the Marines had a number of promotions to some of their lieutenant colonels to colonels. So they had an excess amount of colonels. So it allowed the division commander to get rid of some of his, I guess, less aggressive and older colonels, which he did. But in doing that, he promoted some of his more younger and aggressive leaders up to higher positions. And one in particular was Red Mike Edson, who was the lieutenant colonel before, or sorry, he was a colonel before, but he was the battalion commander of the 1st Raider Battalion at Bloody Ridge. But he was very aggressive, and he was given command of the 5th Marine Regiment. So once Vandergriff had these units he could do some limited offensive with, he knew the remnants of the Japanese that attacked at Bloody Ridge, and also some of the guys who were still there from the very beginning. Some of the construction crews and some of the security elements were around the Matanikau River. So the Matanikau River is probably about, I'd say, 5 to 8 miles. Depends on which part of Henderson Field you do the measurement from, but 5 to 8 miles from Henderson Field to the west. So Matanikau was a major river. You couldn't really ford it unless you forded a couple of points. But Vandergrift wanted the Japanese, because they were concentrated in the area, he wanted them to be pushed way past them. And that way that would, I guess, limit the Japanese advancements to Henderson Field and push them way back, give the Marines a bit of breathing room. So what did he wanted to do? He took 2 of his best battalions at the time. So he put the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Battalion at the 7th Marines. And they were considered some of his best troops. And the poor Raiders, I mean, they'd been fighting at Tulagi and Tazaboko and had a major battle at Bloody Ridge. These guys didn't get much rest. So they put them in the coconut grove, they called them, gave them a few days rest. Then they put them back on the offensive, so to speak. So the first offensive they planned, they would take the 1st Battalion, the 7th Marines, and their battalion commander was probably the most famous Marine of all time, the most decorated Marine of all time, Louis Chesty Puller. Puller was known to be very aggressive and an upfront combat leader who would go after the enemy. So the plan was, on the 23rd, the 23rd of September, the 1st Battalion and the 7th Marines were going to go on the northern slopes of Mount Austen. Well, Mount Austen is not too far from Bloody Ridge, but they were going to go on the east-west trail, it was called. So the Japanese had an east-west trail, and that was the trail they used to advance from the Matanikau River. And plus, it was the I guess track that Kawaguchi and his unit had retreated from after Bloody Ridge. So the Marines didn't know exactly where they were at, so they sent Puller to do a reconnaissance in force on the east-west track, heading to the west to Matanikau. At the same time, the 1st Marine Raiders, or the 1st Raider Battalion, was going to go down the coastal track, or the government track. So the government track was a pre-war track that used to service all the coconut plantations. So it as the name implies, it basically went on a coastal track. It was a little copper cart road, as some of the Marines called it, and it wasn't a great sealed road or anything like that. It was just a dirt trail they could move up and down through. So they was going to, the 1st Raiders were going to walk, I guess, go kind of in parallel with the 1st Battalion and 7th Marines. So the 1st Battalion and 7th Marines, on the 24th, they were moving, and they hit some Japanese pickets on the slopes, and they pushed their pickets back, and the Japanese had a series of cooking fires, and Puller was about a 3rd or 4th man back in the line because he was leading from the front, and he bent down to sample some of the Japanese rice. And I think, Craig, you mentioned before how the Japanese used to carry their rations.
Yeah,
So
I'll mention
yeah.
to the audience, it's a bit of an odd thing to think about because, you know, as they say sometimes, it's the unsexy part of war is the logistics. And for the Japanese compared to the American forces on the islands, the Americans had ready-to-eat rations like C rations or K rations. But for the Japanese, they had more or less, they would lug these bags of rice on their backs with various other things like some dried fruits and some fish if they're lucky. But this meant that at nighttime or whenever they had to eat, they actually had to boil the rice. And this gave away your position, like you said, with the, it's like a smoke signal. And for snipers, this was a pretty crucial flaw in planning, and it would lead to a lot of problems for the Japanese. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet. And yeah, you will see that later. We'll talk about how Guadalcanal became known as Starvation Island for the Japanese.
Oh yeah.
So the rations, they didn't have a lot of rations even to start with. And I guess had the perishable rations too, not like the Marines with their
Get to
C-rats
learn
and K-rats.
from the Japanese accounts. You get to really learn about what you can eat when you can find just about nothing on an island.
Yeah, well, they ate the lizards and the spiders and everything on Guadalcanal. I think, you know, there's all kind of little animals that run around through there. There's not many snakes on Guadalcanal. You know, you read some of these stories. Oh, you know, the poisonous snakes on Guadalcanal. I mean, I was
The
there for years.
Japanese ate them all.
Oh yeah, that's probably what happened. they exterminate them, they put them in extinction. There are some snakes on the island of Guadalcanal, but they're little tree boas or something. They're like little boa snakes, little tiny ones, but not poisonous at all. I think in the Solomon Islands, there's only one variety of poisonous snakes, and it's a sea snake. Yeah, but I think the mosquitoes make up for it. I know that they're still there in swarms. But anyway, the puller had bent down to sample some of this rice, and the Japanese had brought up some of their machine guns at the time. So what the Marines had ran into some of the elements of Colonel Oka, who was a Japanese regimental commander of the 124th Regiment. And Colonel Oka, you'll find out, he's coming in and out of the Guadalcanal campaign all the time, and he actually lived through the Guadalcanal campaign. But it's almost every fight the Marines had for the next 2 or 3 months, Oka was involved somehow, and it wasn't in his favor, so to speak. He was, kind of drew the unlucky straw. But anyway, there was Oka's guys, and they would the ones that really wasn't engaged before so much in Bloody Ridge. I mean, they were involved in the diversionary attack. I think I mentioned, but they didn't do much fighting, so they were fairly fresh. Anyway, they brought up a company of those guys and set the machine guns up. Then they started hitting 1st and 7th Marines pretty hard. But in the ensuing firefight, a number of Marines died. They pushed the Japanese back, and they had about 25 casualties. So they stopped for the night. They pull a radio back to division headquarters. He says, "Look, I've got a number of casualties. I need some stretchers." Division commander said, "Can you continue on?" He go, "Yes, if you send me some more guys." So they sent the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines, which were under a captain at the time, with temporary command. So they sent 2-5, as they're known as, up to Puller and his battalion with stretchers. So Puller sent back 2 rifle companies, carrying his 25 wounded, which it would take 2 rifle companies to take them back, because once again, they didn't have any helicopters in those days, and there's no roads, no jeeps, nothing like that. So they had to hand carry them over this tough terrain, and also provide security. So it would taken at least 300 guys to probably take those 25 back safely. So Puller still had 1 rifle company, and he had another battalion. So he continued on the next day. So they went down into the east-west track. It goes in a place called the Valley, and it goes to the east bank of the Matanikau River. Now, just a side note, the Valley was later known in another Battle of Matanikau. There was a war correspondent named John Hershey, and he wrote a small book, about 60 pages, I think 70 pages. It was called The Valley, or Into the Valley. I think it's maybe The Valley, but it's John Hershey. And it's a good depiction of a Marine rifle company. He's with them when they go under fire going down in that valley. So that's a quite interesting book if any one of your listeners want to see that one. It's called John Hershey Into the Valley, or The Valley. But anyway, they moved down the valley. They went down the east bank of the Matanikau, and they passed a spot known as the One Log Bridge, Nippon Bridge, or the Japanese had, or Japanese One Log Bridge, or Nippon Bridge. It was known to the Marines. So it was I've never seen a photo of it. I know exactly where the site is. I mean, I've visited a number of times, but from this depictions of it, it was a 1 or potentially 2 logs together with a handrail, very crude bridge over the, I guess a point of the Matanikau that's easily crossed, a narrow part. But anyway, they passed it, didn't see any Japanese, and they went into the mouth of Matanikau, and they were receiving a bit of a mortar fire at the time, but they tried to push across the mouth of Matanikau, and they sent 1 platoon over, and they got hit pretty hard machine gun fire. But division, they radioed back. Division thought that the Marines had actually made it to the other side, so they did a guy called Twining, who was the operation officer. He did a plan on the fly, so to speak. And they sent, so the Raiders, first Raiders were getting on the scene at this time. So they had 2 battalions there, and they decided to do a plan to eliminate these Japanese, because the Marines intelligence, just like the Japanese intelligence failed at a number of times in the campaign. So the Marines thought they only had about 300 to 400 Japanese in that whole area, and they were very disorganized, and they've been easily to be pushed over. But what the Marines didn't know, the Japanese had landed a fresh regiment, the 4th Japanese Regiment, the 2nd Sendai Division. So they were fresh troops. It's probably about almost 2,000, 2,000 to 3,000 of them over there, fresh troops. So they sent Edson up, 5th Marine Regimental Commander, to take charge of the overall operation. So the plan was the next day they were going to take 2-5 under Puller and push across the mouth of Matanikau in a holding action to pin the Japanese at the mouth of Matanikau. And at the same time, they were going to send the 1st Raider Battalion about 2,000 yards back down the bank of Matanikau and cross at the Japanese one-log bridge. And then they were going to flank the village. Then they also had the 2 rifle companies that the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had sent back to the perimeter with those wounded. They were going to throw them into some landing craft, and they were going to land slightly west of Point Cruz, which is a little peninsula that juts out there. And they were going to come in from behind the Japanese. So they were going to pin the Japanese and destroy them. So that was the overall plan. So they started pushing platoons across the mouth of Matanikau, and they were getting hit pretty hard. The Raiders were moving up to the one-log bridge, but unbeknownst to the Marines, the night before, the Japanese had pushed a reinforced platoon across the river, and they were in a nice tight defensive position. And if you go to that position to today, you can see that's, it's a good bottleneck. It's straight up cliff on the left-hand side, and there's only about, I'd say, less than 100 meters between the river and the cliff face. So, and it's right before you get to the one-log bridge, so they had a great position there. So the Raiders were moving up, and I think I did discuss him in the last episode. There's a guy called Ken Bailey. He was a major at that time. He was the executive officer of the 1st Battalion, Raider Battalion. So Bailey was a very instrumental leader. They looked up to him, big fella. Always led from the front. A lot of these Marine officers, especially Raider officers, did. So he's moving up. They started getting machine gun fire. So he's standing up trying to find out where the machine gun fire is coming from. And the first-hand account said there was a machine gun burst that got him in the face and the chest and killed him instantly. So they're stuck there. The battalion commander, who was Lieutenant Colonel Sam Griffin, he came up, seen his executive officer dead, became very mad, as you can imagine, and decided they needed to flank these Japanese, or tried to flank the Japanese. So he took a unit and tried to flank the Japanese. But I've been to that spot, and you look at it and I think there's no way in the world you get up these cliffs. So they tried, and he ended up getting shot in the shoulder and severely wounded, and the attack stopped. So that's one of the few times the Raiders were ever stopped in the Pacific War, was at that time there. But Bailey, I think I mentioned in the last episode, he'd earned a Medal of Honor. He was nominated, and he later received a Medal of Honor posthumously. He didn't even know he ever received it for the Battle of Bloody Ridge less than 2 weeks earlier. So it was a major blow for the Raiders. Anyway, the Raiders were stuck there. 2-5 was stuck. So at the same time all this was occurring, there was a major Japanese air raid at the airfield, and the communications were distorted. So just like the fog of war happens, a lot of engagements such as this, the division command thought the Marines were across the river, the Raiders were across. So that gave them the green light to send their amphibious force of the 1-7 around in the end run. So they sent these guys in, they threw them on the boats real quick, and they landed. And when they landed at just west of Point Cruz. So any of you viewers ever been, or sorry, any of your listeners ever been to Guadalcanal? Honiara is the capital city, and that's built straight on this battlefield. And if they ever stay at the King Sol Hotel or a couple of other big hotels there now, it's basically on the same ground these guys landed. And like the police stations and all that is roughly where this area these guys fought over. So they landed and they went up to the nearest high point, which is Hill 84. And they noticed they were going through bivouacs, and they was going through the Japanese bivouacs. They quickly evacuated, was watching them. So they went up to the top. Executive officer was a guy named Major Ortho Rogers. So he called his 2 company commanders together in a command group, and a mortar hit right in the command group and killed him instantly, and severely wounded another one. So the fight was on. The Japanese had him pinned down. So Puller was trying to tell Edson, he goes, look, my guys are there, we need to get them out. So Edson was trying to formulate a plan, trying to say, okay, let's see if we can work this out. And Puller, being Puller, was a bit rash and says, no, you're not going to leave my guys to suffer or to die. So he he jumped in a small boat and he went out to the USS Monson, which was a 4-stacker destroyer, which was providing covering fire back at Kukum. So he jumps on that, gets a guy called Coast Guardman Douglas Munro, who was the leader of the landing craft, and they went back. And in their haste, the Marines forgot the radios, so they're using the semaphore flags. They jumped a guy called Raysbrook, Sergeant Raysbrook. He jumped up on the ridge under Japanese fire and started doing the signal flagging to Puller, who was on the destroyer. So they basically started laying down a quarter of fire, 5 inches on the left and right, to allow the Marines to evacuate. So Marines evacuated, and Douglas Munro, this is the only time a U.S. Coast Guardman earned a Medal of Honor, and all the U.S. Coast Guards, and if you speak to them to this day, they know about Munro. So Munro, his gunner in the lead of his ship was hit and wounded, so he jumped on a machine gun in the bow of the boat in the front of the boat, and it was a Lewis gun. And at the time the Marines were evacuating, one of the Marines, one of the landing craft was hung up on a sandbar. They hooked up some cables trying to pull it off. So Munro put his boat between that boat and the Japanese to provide covering fire. And then when the boat was freed, Munro was basically hitting the head with a machine gun fire. And he later died very shortly after that. And he was nominated for the Medal of Honor. So the Marines evacuated, got everyone out, and it was the only time in the Guadalcanal Campaign the Marines actually suffered a defeat and gave the Japanese a little bit of I guess, a pep up, so to speak, and motivated. So that was known as the Second Battle of Matanikau. So Marines moved back to the perimeter and kind of licked their wounds, but they knew there was a lot of Japanese there and they wanted to push them out. So this leads up to the Third Battle of the Matanikau. The Third Battle of Matanikau happened from the 7th to the 9th of October. So it was basically the same plan, but this time it was a bit more thought out with intelligence, more artillery support. They were going to use 5 battalions, and that was the largest attack the Marines had in their campaign to that date. So the 5th Marines were going to, once again, they were going to attack at the mouth of Matanikau and hold the Japanese. And then there were 3 battalions of the 7th Marines who were going to singly cross this one log bridge. That one log bridge got a lot of work out during the whole campaign, I tell you that, with the Japanese and Marines going back and forth across it. But they were going to move across, and then there's a series of 3 big ridges there in Guadalcanal, and one battalion was going down one ridge, 2nd ridge, and 3rd ridge. Each battalion was going to take a ridge, and then they were basically flank the Japanese and destroy them. So at the same time, the Japanese had decided to do a major offensive in Guadalcanal. So they started bringing in elements of the 2nd Japanese Sendai Division to be their main offensive force. So the elements of those guys started landing. So the Japanese knew that they were going to be bringing heavy artillery and tanks later on in October. So what they wanted to do was form a beachhead on the east bank of the Matanikau. And that would be a good jumping off point for their attack, because they knew the only place you could bring tanks could cross Matanikau was at that mouth, because that's where the coastal track, it went across the mouth of Matanikau. Kind of like Alligator Creek, the only place you could cross is a sandbar, at certain times of the day, then you could cross them the sandbar, and it was like a natural bridge. But that's the only place the Japanese could cross with the tanks there. And they knew if they could cross it and have a staging point, assembly points on the other side of the river, then they could just shoot straight down the coastal track, straight into Henderson Field, basically, and give Marines a hard time. So they were very prepared to hold the Matanikau. So the Marines had that same idea. They wanted to make sure the Japanese was well away from the Matanikau. So the Marines beat the Japanese to the punch, so to speak, and they started their offensive. Now, when the Marines moved up, they thought all the Japanese were on the west bank of Matanikau, but what the Japanese had done, they'd put a reinforced company across, and they had dug in about 400 or 500 yards from the mouth of Matanikau. So these Marine battalions, the 5th Marines, hit these guys, and the fight was on. It was very close quarter. It was jungle, and then couldn't see each other. So they were pinned down and they were fighting pretty hard. And the poor raiders were promised, okay, we're going to hold you back. We got a big convoy coming in around October the 13th, and you'll be evacuated from the island, so you don't have to do any more fighting. But the overall command, once again, was Edson, and Edson loved his raiders. So he asked for a raider company to come up to assist. And then he asked for another company. Then most of the raiders came up to assist in that. So the one last fight. So they were pinned down, fighting, and the raiders had actually formed over the mouth of Matanikau. The Japanese decided to do a breakout that night, and they overran one of the platoons of the raiders and killed like 12 raiders. And most of the Japanese died. They didn't cross the mouth, but yeah, the raiders got hit pretty hard. The next morning, the 3 battalions of the 7th Marines, well, I won't say all 7th. You had 2 battalions of the 7th, and the 2nd Marine Regiment, I think if you remember my last episode, was part of the 2nd Marine Division, but because they didn't have the 7th Marine Regiment initially, the Marine High Command gave the 1st Marine Division the 2nd Marines. So the 2nd Marines Regiment was actually the first ones to land, and they were they were kind of the last ones to leave. So they got kind of the raw end of the stick. But they were garrisoned Tulagi, which is like 20 miles away. They'd brought one of their battalions over as a fresh battalion. So they had the 3rd Battalion, the 2nd Marines, involved in this attack. It was under a fellow named Colonel Whaling, Bill Whaling. And a little side note here about Whaling. Whaling had formed something called the Whaling Group. It was a good idea. So Whaling was, in his history, he'd fought in the Great War, the First World War I, or World War I as a Marine, enlisted. He did quite well there, and he'd fought through the banana wars in the 20s and 30s in Haiti and Nicaragua. So he was very experienced woodsman, outdoorsman. He was Olympic shooter. I forget which Olympics he was in. So what he had done too, he was the executive officer of the 5th Marines, and he had an idea. He went to the division commander and chief of staff, and he said, look, that was the days before you had Marine reconnaissance or scout snipers and things like that. So they were just doing their own scouting from the infantry platoon. So he said, look, this is jungle. We need some good scouts, and it'd be worth the wait and go. So can I just I guess go through the battalions and ask them for anyone with previous shooting experience, hunters and woodsmen, and I can put them in a unit, give them some more training, and use them as the scouts and snipers for the division. And they said that's a good idea. So he started doing that, and they were called the Whaling Group. And what he would also do, he'd rotate these guys back to the normal unit so they just share their experience. So it was a good idea. And later in the war, the Marines formed their scout snipers and reconnaissance units. So that was a good little I guess origin from it. But anyway, Whaling was in charge of the Whaling Group, which is his scout snipers in the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. And he had the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Puller, who just had a hard time, 2 weeks earlier. Then the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines under another interesting fellow called H.H. Hannikin. Guadalcanal is like the who's who, of the U.S. Marine Corps in World War II. All the legends, was all together in the first team. Yeah, if you think about it, yeah, through the war, they spread out and went to the other divisions, but you had them all in one unit, so to speak, in the 1st Marine Division. It was the who's who, if you look back on it. But Hannikin had earned the Medal of Honor, I think it was in Haiti, and it's a good story if you any of you listeners want to look him up. He'd earned the Medal of Honor. He dressed up like the local guerrilla, like a guerrilla, penetrated the guerrilla leader's camp, and him and another guy assassinated or killed the guerrilla leader and ended the kind of insurrection at that stage. And then the guerrilla leader's replacement, and he came in and he ended up killing him later. Then I think he went to Nicaragua, and there's a guerrilla leader, and he infiltrated his camp there and captured him. So he was a pretty capable fellow. He earned a battlefield commission. But anyway, it's a bit of a side note. But anyway, he had those three units and 3 good commanders. So they moved out, crossed, and they were going down the ridges, and they had the Japanese pin. So they started really getting into the Japanese. And Puller's actually battalion called a Japanese battalion of the 4th Japanese Regiment, a fresh one in a place called the Ravine. So if you go to Honolulu to this day, where the Parliament House is, if you go not too far from the Parliament House, it's a deep ravine, and the coral ridges in Guadalcanal to this day, if you see them, all the ridges are fairly barren due to the coral. I was told, and then in the ravines are thick jungle. So obviously it's with the river or the creeks and stuff going through them, so it's a good place to bivouac. The Japanese were called in there, and Puller started calling in his mortar fire on both ends, and he had a Japanese trapped, and he had a 75mm howitzers. Artillery support was pinning these Japanese too. And then the Japanese, if you go to this ravine to this day, it's straight up and down. So they tried to get out on the other side, and the machine guns started taking the Japanese out. And I think Puller, one of his commanders, said it was a machine made for extermination. That was what that whole episode was. So they got a bit of a payback from 2 weeks earlier. And at this time, the reports, the Marine High Command was receiving reports that Japanese were coming in force. I think at the time, I haven't verified it, but I think they had access to magic, which is the code breaker, Japanese naval code breaking. I think they were getting some intel basically saying that, look, the Japanese are coming in with a lot of reinforcements. So they thought they were going to hit the perimeter, which was lightly manned. So they were given an order to withdraw back to the perimeter. But they drew back to the perimeter. In the meantime, I think they were accredited with killing like 600 or 700 Japanese, and which put a big, almost decimated whole 4th Japanese Regiment. And it knocked the Japanese back a bit. So they moved back into the perimeter once again. So you got anything you want to add, Greg? I've been yapping away here.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I just was listening attunely.
Okay, so around I think the 9th or 8th, roughly around this same time, the Japanese 17th Army commander landed, Hayataki, Lieutenant General Hayataki. He landed and was taking personal command of Guadalcanal Campaign. So once again, that's another, I guess, another indication how the Japanese were taking this very, very seriously. So he landed with the 17th Army. You would know that I think the Japanese, the armies, we say army, it's not like the Western armies at the time. It was more like a corps size, I think. Their armies were like two or three divisions.
Yeah.
Which, in the Western army at that time, a corps was 2 or 3 divisions. But anyway, Hayataki landed and he formed his headquarters at Kukumbona. And that was the area where he'd formed. So the Japanese had a major plan going at the time, and they were going to, with air, sea, and land, they were really going to knock these Americans off Guadalcanal. So, Yamamoto, the naval commander, was involved. Massive amount of air was coming to Rabaul, or Rabaul, as some people call it. And they were getting a lot of reinforcements, because you can remember the Henderson Field was getting hit almost every day with air raids. Normally around 11 or 12 o'clock, the Marines called it Tojo time. That's how long it took them to fly from Rabaul to hit it. And then, I could go off sidetrack and talk about the Coast Watchers and, and how the Marine Wildcats would take 45 minutes to get up to 20,000 feet. And yeah, it's good. It's good study about all that. But try not to get sidetracked here. So the Japanese plan was to, before they were landing all their troops mainly in fast destroyers, the Japanese called rat runs, and the Marines call them Tokyo Express down the slot there in Solomon Islands. The Japanese said, well, we've got these transports, and we've got, tanks and heavy artillery, and we can't put them on destroyers, so we need to put them on these transports. But they're a bit slow. So the Japanese ruled the night, so to speak, with their naval support, and the Marines ruled the day with their air support from Henderson Field. So they knew that they couldn't get those transports in at night and get them out the next day, or vice versa, before the Marine air could take them out. So they had to neutralize Henderson Field. So Japanese Naval High Command come up with a plan. They said, okay, what we'll do is we'll send our battleships down, and we'll just obliterate the airfield with just naval bombardment. Because you got to remember, the Marines were getting hit almost every night by naval bombardment. Because then when the Japanese would do their rat runs or supply runs with these fast destroyers, those fast destroyers would drop off And then on the way out, they'd fire a few rounds into the perimeter, with their 5-inch rounds. So the Marines getting hit every night with that. So they're getting kind of used to it. So the plan was Yamamoto formed the largest naval group since Midway. They were going to push out, excuse me, they're going to push out, and then they were going to bombard Henderson Field, neutralize it. Then they would allow them to unload their transports without being harassed in the day. They were going to remain off and try to draw the American carriers out, because once they were going to do a major attack and hopefully draw the American carriers out and finish the American carriers once and for all.
Because it was, Yamamoto's basically his obsession was to have the decisive naval battle, and he was looking for it this entire time. And
I guess it potentially gave them the opportunity because they knew the American carriers had been in the area, and they thought, well, we can draw them out because they're waiting on us. So the plan was to land the 2nd Division in full, heavy artillery, tanks, and some more of the elements of the 38th Japanese Division. They were going to land, and the plan was they were going to take their tanks. It was a tank company, about 12 tanks, and supported by a regiment, and they were going to attack starting on the 22nd of October, and they were going to attack across the mouth of Matanikau, because at that time the Marines had pushed forward 2 battalions to hold the mouth of Matanikau to keep the Japanese off balance. So they were going to pin those Marine battalions there, take another Japanese regiment, attack at the cross at the One Log Bridge, because the Marines, the 2 forward deployed battalions, there's a ridge called Koli Ridge to this day. Their flank was refused, so to speak. It was open, so they were going to cut those 2 battalions off. It was kind of like a reverse plan that the Marines had done in the 2nd or 3rd Battle of Matanikau, and the Japanese were going to do it reverse. But at the same time, Murayama, which is the division commander of the 2nd Division, he had ordered his engineers to start from Kukumbona, which was the 17th Army's headquarters, and go south to southeast and cut a 15-mile road. They call it a road, it's more of a trail, called a Murayama Trail. And it was going to go around Mount Austen, go to the miles south of the perimeter, the Marine perimeter, and then come straight up and attack over Bloody Ridge. They're just going to replicate their attack they did on the September with Bloody Ridge. So it was a good plan, and they were going to pin the Marines, and they knew that southern flank would be lightly held, and they would have a whole division, well, about 7,000 Japanese concentrated straight over the ridge, straight into the airfield. So it was a good plan. So they initiated it. They started doing the air raids, and then the night of the 13th, or the day, I'll backtrack. On the 13th of October, the Marines received another big resupply, and they also, the first time the U.S. Army, because the U.S. Army had been, the Marines have been thinking the U.S. Army is going to relieve them from almost week 1, because the Marines are going to land. They're assault troops. They land, take the island, take the beach, and then the Army is going to come garrison. But, the Army never came for a number of reasons. So the first U.S. Army unit started arriving. It was the 164th Infantry Regiment. And these guys were a National Guard unit from the Dakotas. I think maybe Wisconsin too, but definitely from the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. Big raw bone farm boys, as they were described as. And they turned out to be very, very good unit. But they landed on the 13th of October, and then the Raiders left on the same transports. They'd done their time in hell, so to speak, and they'd served the time, and they're on the way out. I think there were only 800 of them landed, and there were about 200 effective at the end. They suffered a lot of casualties. So they had landed on the 13th of October. So that night, the 2 Japanese battleships had come into the off Iron Bottom Sound. I think I have to double check, but I think 15 kilometers away, they started pounding the perimeter with 14-inch naval rounds. So in a short time, they fired almost 1,000 naval rounds.
It was incredible.
I think you had the
I
think you had the exact count, like 900 and it's almost
937 14-inch shells, and they ran out of their high explosive shells. They ended up having to use the armor piercing that's used for shooting at ships in the end to just keep putting the damage down. It must have been absolutely terrifying. I've read accounts from the Marines that were there, and it was the stuff of nightmares.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've to this day, well, I don't find too many 14 inchers, but there's one in the police, their EOD, their explosive disposal guys. They have like a little outdoor museum. They've got a 14-inch round fired that night there. It was an armor piercing one too. And they've cut it in half where you can see it, but yeah, it's an armor piercing one. But you can imagine armor piercing ones firing a shell the same size of a VW bug, a car. If that landed beside you, it didn't matter if it exploded or not. That would do some damage to you, especially if it, hit your tent, so to speak. But yeah, and basically over that night, they fired all those rounds. And that was, and I think we discussed it before. I can't think of any other place, any other time that Allied soldiers in the whole World War II was underwent this intensive naval shelling. Because they did it this night, and they did it the next 2 nights too, with 8-inch and 5 inches. They fired over 1,000 8-inch rounds and 5 inches round the next night. And I think the 5 inches and 8 hit them. So 3 nights in a row, they got smashed, literally smashed pretty hard. But basically what it is, the next day, most of the Cactus Air Force, as it was called, was destroyed. I mean, they had a few planes they could put up in the air, but a lot of the avgas or aviation fuel was gone. Luckily they'd spread out some of their avgas and they had enough to fly a few missions, but they had basically decimated them so much. The Japanese, the next day, the Marines said they could see the Japanese transports and they could see them offloading in full daylight. And they couldn't do anything about it. And it was so frustrating for them.
Yeah, a lot of them could watch. They had good vantage points to see the entire thing, and they called it a fast run for the Japanese.
Yeah,
It would be one of the few times they'd be able to actually unload. But they still, in the end, they would only be able to unload about 2/3 of their supplies. They got all the men, but not all the supplies.
Yeah, because the Marines and the Marines did put a few planes up, and they were still harassing them. I mean, there's once again, that's a sidetrack. We could talk about how how the Marines cannibalized some of the planes, and they had a Franken plane or something like that they called it. And yeah, it was there's some great stories there with the air campaign alone.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think Franken plane or Frankenstein plane or something. They just off bits and pieces of a plane, they put it together and it did some damage. Right, it's a good story. So that allowed them to offload most of their, especially all their heavy artillery. So they were unloaded a large number of 150 millimeter and 100 millimeter heavy artillery. I'll speak about the heavy artillery right now. The Marines called them, and the Army called them Pistol Pete. Now, some accounts you read, some guys think Pistol Pete was a singular cannon, but it wasn't. It was the name given to any big artillery round that landed in Henderson Field or landed amongst the Marines. I mean, when you say big artillery round, at one stage, 75 millimeter rounds were hitting them around the Marines, and they said, "Oh, that's Pistol Pete," But that was the name synonymous for the Japanese heavy artillery. So Japanese heavy artillery landed in 150 mils from Kukumbona, where the Japanese headquarters was, could strike Henderson Field. The Marines couldn't counter battery fire because they had nothing that large to counter battery fire. They only had the 105 millimeter howitzers. I mean, the 11th Marine Regiment is the artillery regiment. They had 5 battalions, but the 5th battalion was the 155 millimeter, but it was left in New Zealand when the Marines left to land on Guadalcanal because they didn't have enough shipping to take it and its prime movers. So I think the 155s of the Army and the US Marines only landed late October, early November. So, they started smashing Henderson Field too, once they got set up. And then, so the plan was, you had these guys, so they decimated, they unloaded, and they started moving through the jungle. So once again, the Japanese, the terrain beat the Japanese. They underestimated the terrain. She had 7,000 guys moving through that thick jungle. And, to this day, if you go in there, you think, how in the world could they do it? And they're carrying all their artillery too. Each Japanese soldier had to carry 175 millimeter round.
Well, they carried it for a while, but a lot of them actually ended up having not to carry it.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's kind of, you could see why they did it. to this day, if you go down the Murayama track or remnants of the trail, you can still find 75 millimeters laying rounds laying in the jungle unfired, where you can see some private just threw it out of his backpack.
You know,
I remember. Yeah, go ahead.
When you read a lot of the accounts from the Japanese side, whether it's Guadalcanal or some of the other islands, there's it's kind of a theme about it's usually food. It's usually starvation that you hear. But another thing that I heard, particularly when it came to this account, when they were carrying the artillery, it's the weight of the equipment the Japanese had. And I don't know if a lot of the viewer listeners know. It's a little bit ironic, but if you look at all the armies in World War II, the Japanese were some of the smaller guys, but they had the heaviest equipment. They had the largest bayonets, the heaviest rifle, they had the heaviest ration pack. And then these guys who had to bring this artillery, the pieces of the artillery, they basically, from the accounts I read, a lot of them, they couldn't do it. They, after a few days marching, they actually had to give it up. So
Yeah,
it's
you can see. Yeah.
it's just it's another one of those small little details that kind of like Japanese logistics was not up to par.
Yeah, I mean, I've carried in those same jungles. I've been on parts of the Murayama track, and I've been in jungles elsewhere in the world. But I'm telling you, you're carrying just a little bit of weight, and you can feel it very quickly. And they had a lot of bulky items too. I mean, they're just stripping apart a whole 70 millimeter howitzer, 75 millimeter howitzer. It's just amazing what they thought they could achieve, but just the whole mentality of them thinking they could do it. It's you just got to take your hats off to them for the determination.
It's the old idea that
insane.
Well, the officers in the Japanese military used to tell all the men that while the technology was against them, it was the spirit of the Japanese spirit that would win the day in the end.
Yeah.
It was the tenacity, and the kudos to them for fighting like that. But the logistics didn't pan out. Yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said, logistics on Guadalcanal, both forces are fighting at the end of the logistic trail. I mean, it's a great study in logistics. The logistics win the wars. Win campaigns.
Yeah.
But these guys moved through the jungle, and they underestimated the jungle. Murayama division commander delayed his attack. It's supposed to go on the 22nd. He delayed it, to the 23rd. So the guys at the mouth of Matanikau, the tanks, they did a probing attack at one stage with a couple of tanks. And they said, this is what the Marines had over there. Then they pulled them back. So they were getting ready. But the Marines on that line, like I said, they had 2 battalions, and the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment and the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Marine Regiment. So they were dug in there. And they also had their special weapons, like the 37 millimeters. They had 75 millimeter howitzers on half tracks, the M3 half tracks. So they've become very important. And then more importantly, they had 4 battalions of artillery with 75 millimeters and the 105 millimeters registered in to the other side of that river. And I read where each gun was given a 50-yard path. I said, this is you're going to fire on this 50-yard strip up and down, up and down. They're all registered, ready to go. So they were waiting for the Japanese, because they knew that's where the Marines thought where the Japanese were going to hit from. So the Japanese are trying to move through the thick jungle. Marines had no clue they're coming in from the south. They had their local scouts, which is Solomon Island scouts. They were very good guys. They wouldn't get any intel. They wouldn't picking them up on the normal scouts, like whaling scouts, snipers weren't picking them up. Air cover wasn't picking them up, because the Japanese were going through that thick jungle and way to the south where no one expect them to be there. So what the Marines did, they had the 7th Marines on that line. And they had the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, Puller once again, and they had Hannikin 27. They were manning that line. That line, Marines had a good line there. I mean, you can go there to this day and still see all the bunker holes and the barbed wire. It's all still there. Unfortunately, farming and the encroachment, modern encroachment has taken up a lot of it, but a lot of it's still there. But they dug in quite a bit, and they had the coconut log bunkers or coconut logs on the overhead. Like if you ever see the HBO series, the Pacific with Barcelona, and that's the area where Barcelona was at. But those, I guess for the movie or the series, they made it with wasn't covered, so I guess you could see the actors, but they were generally covered log bunkers, and they'd cut firing lanes in the jungle, and they had like 4 foot high barbed wire, thick barbed wire, double barbed wire strands in there. So it was a great defensive position. They only could see I think Barcelona said he could see 30, it was 30 feet from the barbed wire line. He could see about another 20 yards on the other side. So they had limited amount of fire. What the Marines would do, they'd cut firing lanes. So they'd cut these firing lanes at angles, knowing that's a path of least resistance. And, the Japanese infiltration techniques, they go through the thick jungle. And, even if you're in a thick jungle, you're going to hit a path of least resistance. You're going to take it. So they were trying to lure them in those firing lanes and then, basically killing lanes with a machine gun. But a little side note there, those bunkers, almost every bunker had a machine gun in it. You think, how many machine guns does a battalion rate? And how do they get all these machine guns? But what the accounts stated that they weren't that far from the boneyard, which is the aircraft crash yard where they put all the wrecked aircraft from Fighter One in Henderson Field. So they were scavenging 50 cal and 30 cal machine guns off those planes and putting them in their bunkers. You got a young Marine private with a bolt action 1903 Springfield rifle, and he's sitting in his bunker, and then his good buddy or his mate comes back with a 30 cal machine gun. He's going, "Oh, where'd you get that from?" He goes, "Oh, just go back there to the wrecked planes and grab your machine gun." Of course, he's going to run back and get him a machine gun too. So you can see almost every bunker had a machine gun. They had heaps of ammunition. And Vandergrift division commander actually visited there when he said, "This is a machine gunner's paradise." So the Marines were waiting on him. But saying that, they didn't expect an attack from the south. So what Vandergrift did, he pulled Hannikin's battalion, which is manning basically Bloody Ridge. He pulled him off the ridge. And he sent them on the ridge all up to Matanikau. Because remember before I said you had 2 Marine battalions up front on the Matanikau, and their flank was exposed on the ridge. So they knew the Japanese could basically flank those 2 battalions. So they put Hannikin's battalion up on that ridge to protect them. So they put 3 battalions up front. But what that did, though, it left that southern line with Puller's battalion. He had to take over 2 battalion front. So he had to cover 2,500 yards, and he had the 164th U.S. Army tied into his left. But still, he only had 500 guys to cover those. So he had 500 guys spread out over 2,500 yards, ready to accept roughly 6,000 to 7,000 Japanese concentrated attack. In the second Sendai division, one of the best divisions they had. So, the Marines are getting set up for a major fall here. But the attack was delayed. The word got back to the 23rd. Okay, delayed it one day, and we were almost in the jungle. He said, "I can't make it on the 23rd, it'll be the 24th." But once again, there's always someone that don't get the word. And in this case, it was the Japanese general in Matanikau. So he didn't get the word. So he attacked with his tanks. They started out 9 tanks. They attacked with 9 tanks across in a row, like ducks in a row across the mouth of Matanikau. There's some famous photos. You still see those 9 tanks in a row on Guadalcanal. So they started out, and the Marines started hitting them pretty hard with 37 millimeter anti-tank fire and a 75 millimeter off the half tracks. And at the same time, the infantry supporting those tanks started out in their assembly areas, and the Marines started landing all their artillery, pre-registered artillery. So it was reported they fired over 6,000 rounds in a small area. It basically decimated.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Yeah, they basically decimated the Japanese in their tracks. Whole companies are being wiped out in the assembly area before you even get to the attack points or attack lines. And one of the Marine veterans of the Great War, World War I, said, "Look, place looked like the Argonne or the Somme or something like. It looked like a World War I battlefield. All the craters there and everything." So basically it just almost wiped the whole regiment. Not wiped them out, but just destroyed their attack before it even started. And the tanks were all taken out, mainly by the 37 millimeters. One tank made it to the other bank, and there was one Marine private that stuck a hand grenade in the track and blew, stopped it. And then a 75 millimeter took it out. So basically their attack was decimated. Colonel Oka was going to lead the flanking attack across the bridge and on the ridge. And so Oka's back in there again. But once again, he was delayed, so he didn't attack that night. So they couldn't even coordinate between those 2 forces that was operating together. And so that attack stopped. The guys on the south haven't attacked yet. So on the night of 24th, 25th, the southern group attacked. So this is going to be known as the Battle of Henderson Field. So they attacked, and luckily for the Marines, the Japanese could only attack in company strength, because to this day that jungle is super thick. I mean, I've walked that jungle, I don't know how many times. I've probably been in that jungle more than anyone other than a local that I can think of, the researching those bunkers and that line. There was 2 trails the Japanese used because they took the path of least resistance. One of the trails was in the middle of C Company, and that's where the famous Marine John Basilone comes in. So Basilone was a heavy machine gun sergeant, section leader. He had 4 heavy machine guns with a 1917 water cooled machine gun. He had 2 bunkers. And I won't get into much detail of his actions, but if you go to my, a lot of these I've been talking about, if you go to my YouTube site on the Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield, you'll see these sites, how they look today. And I'm basically giving you a tour of these sites.
And please do check out his YouTube channel, everybody. It's amazing seeing your episodes. And it's one thing to talk about these battles and see the photos. Well, when there are photos, mind you. But for you to actually go to the physical location and show what it looks like today, especially these remote locations that many people have never seen in their lives, it's very interesting.
Yeah, like I said at the very beginning, not some guys who go the week-long tours there, never go off the beaten track, so to speak. They go to the itinerary. But yeah, Basilone, the Medal of Honor site's there. So, but he was covering that important trail. And he's also providing covering fire for a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. And they had a gate. No, I can't pronounce it. It's a French word, chair de fraise or something. It's like the old, you got the log in the middle with the spikes that stick out, and they had that. It looked like something out of U.S. Civil War photos. U.S. Civil War, you see the chair de fraise or something like that. The French word, it has the spike sticking out on a log.
Well,
and
it's killing me. Someone who actually speaks French. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's probably, I butchered that French. I have no idea, but I think that's pronounced. But anyway, they had that, and there was a gate they would allow. Anyway, they were covering that. And it was only 2 weeks ago I got to speak to a 97-year-old Marine veteran, which I didn't think anyone was still alive, especially from that unit, who switched on. It's just he remembers it like it was yesterday. And as more you speak to him, the more he starts to remember. And he was one of the gunners of that 37 millimeter gun. And it's
That's
just quite
incredible.
amazing. It is incredible. And the stories he's telling, I mean, it's just, once I started speaking to him, I know exactly he was there, and he was, what he was describing, and he's giving me some good info, and he's a good guy. So if you go to my Guadalcanal Facebook site, you'll see him. It's George Mason. And yeah. And I've got actually a map made by one of the veterans after the battle and show all the gun crews, and his name's on there, George Mason gun crew. He tells some great stories, and he's only 17 years old.
It's a really rare experience to speak to anyone who survived these events. I had a very unique. Well, I mean, this is going really off on a tangent. I had a unique experience that was a once in a lifetime, and I found it was a little. It was a little awkward. My family's from the United Kingdom. They came over after the war. Almost everybody, 80% of my family died in the Blitz in London, and I ended up dating a German girl for a while, and I spent some time in Germany. And her grandfather lives out kind of in the boonies of an area called Dusseldorf. And we visited one time, and she knew I was. This is a long time ago. I was very young. She knew I was a World War II buff, and she asked her grandfather if he wanted to tell what was his story of what he had seen. And basically what he told me, he was about 15 or 16 years old. He was in Hitler's youth, and he was on the Eastern Front. And the last hurrah, the Götterdämmerung, when the Russians were coming into Berlin, and he had to run from the eastern part of Germany all the way to the west to try and run and flee to the Americans to surrender. And I've never told the story, but I guess maybe one day on my personal YouTube channel, if I ask her if I can share it, it's harrowing, harrowing to say the least. Yeah,
it'd be actually a good account to listen to. A lot of people be interested in that. Okay, I'm trying to think. Oh, we're at Henderson Field. Okay, we're at Basilone. Okay. So the Japanese took the path of least resistance. So they started hitting the Marine lines, and luckily for the Marines, the Japanese were attacking piecemeal. One Japanese regiment, 230th Regiment, And these are the same guys involved in, because remember, the 38th Division was involved in Hong Kong, in invasion Timor, and in Java. So these guys were veterans. But one of the regiment, 230th Regiment, they were attached to the second. Just to show you how disorientating that thick jungle is at night, instead of attacking, south to north, they went parallel. They were parallel in the Marine lines, and they were totally flipped around, and they were moving out way to the east. So that whole regiment wouldn't evolved into attack at all over 2 nights. They just got so sidetracked. So the Japanese hit with this. It was 16th and 29th Regiment. So they attacked, and the Marines were stopping them. They're holding them quite hard. And the Marines had artillery support, so they were like really stopping the Japanese in their attacks. Just like the veteran told me too. He said he said you couldn't stop them. You had to kill them. He said you have to kill these guys to stop them. They were just running massive into our guns. There was no stopping them. Now you had the 3rd Battalion of the 164th. They were the only reserves that the division had, so they're back in the airfield. So Puller said, "Look, this is the main attack," and the division said, "Yeah, well, okay, this is the main attack. Now we need some support." So he sent the Padre back, or the battalion Padre, and he guided these guys in, and he sent one man from each platoon to bring these in. So because of they're basically coming in at night, they dropped one Army guy in with a Marine. They said, "This is the only way we can do it. Just drop them in." So they and the Army had at that stage M1 Garand, so the Marine had the old bow action rifles, even though the Marines had a lot of machine guns. But they said once you drop those Army guys in there, they started fighting. They said you could really hear the intensity of the gunfire go up. I guess that was one. You got more guys in there, and 2, you got the M1 Garands.
Yeah, it's
so
a
they
classic
really,
sound.
Oh yeah, they really helped the Marines out. I mean, you can go there to this day and find the stripper clips from the 03 Springfields, and you can find the Grand clips all together, all mingled in. It's quite amazing to see that, the evidence of that action. So they stopped the Japanese that night, and they reconsolidated the line. So the 1st Battalion, 7 Marines moved up on Bloody Ridge, and the 164th then took over their positions. And then the next night, the Japanese attacked more in force, and their main concentration then was a place called Coffin Corner. If you go to one of my videos, Coffin Corner, you could see, and it was a jeep trail into a large open field, and the field was about 2,000 yards long, about 300 or 400 yards, or about 200 yards wide. And the Marines in the Army had that would crisscross barbed wire, and they had all the bunkers. And I've got some good photos that showed of what it looked like at the time. The Japanese were all concentrating on one jeep trail, and that jeep trail went straight to the Fighter 1, which led on to Henderson Field. So they were concentrating there. And then once again, the Army and the Marines just basically stacked them up. And it was called Coffin Corner because one of the Marine veterans said, "If I was a coffin maker, I'd be a millionaire. I'd be a millionaire here." So the Japanese attacked that night. They had a limited penetration. I think the regimental commander, the 16th Regiment, Colonel, he made it through with his color guard group, they called it, and they were pinned down in the area. And I've actually located the area. It took me a while, but I located the area. We actually found some evidence on the ground that it's substantiated that in relation to some other evidence with the maps and unit reports. But yeah, and the next day, the Marines ended up wiping those guys out too. But there was one general and 2 colonels that died in that attack. And I still say I haven't found any evidence to suggest otherwise, but that attack, I think, at Coffin Corner was the last Japanese offensive attack in the Pacific War, not counting China, Burma, India, because you got to remember, Japanese did banzai attacks in other campaigns, but that wasn't like an offensive attack, so to speak. The Japanese on Guadalcanal was on the offensive at this stage. Their Marines are on, and Army on the defensive. Japanese are on the offensive. So it was the last concentrated offensive attack. And it was the largest Japanese attack on the island too. So at Coffin Corner alone, they ended up killing anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 Japanese along that line. They ended up killing them. So that was stopped the Japanese in its tracks. And those Japanese then had to retreat back down the Murayama Road, and they were out of food by the time they even reached the front line. So they had to retreat back down it. So that ended the last Japanese major assault of the campaign at the Battle of Henderson Field. that leads us up to November. So this is all done and dusted on the 20th. And once again, the Battle of Santa Cruz Island, which is a big naval battle. So the Japanese did lure the Americans out, so to speak. And they fought a major carrier battle.
Yeah, I
But,
guess for the audience, just to explain, this is simultaneously happening. It's a little hard to describe, but there's this entire naval engagement that's an extraordinary naval battle that's occurring with the carriers Enterprise, Hornet versus the Shokaku, Zukaku, and the light aircraft carrier, not as popular. I think it was the Zoihu. Yeah.
Yeah, major battle. And at the same time, on the Sunday, on the 25th, the Marines called it Dugout Sunday because the Japanese did a major aerial assault. You know, you had the land-based bombers and you had the carrier-based planes, and they were smashing Henderson Field. I forgot, like almost 100, 80 to 100, something like that. You know, they were just smashing them. And the Marines called it Dugout Sunday because most of them stayed in the dugout that day. So that was, you know, not to come out.
It's really, it's at this point where you're really starting to talk about the unsung heroes, the guys repairing that airfield. My God.
CBs.
Yeah.
Can't fault the CBs, you know, they were the unsung hero of the whole Pacific War. CBs. Yep. It's amazing what they did. Well, like I said, we could go down many rabbit holes here, but I'll try to stay on track. So that ended last end of October 27, 28. So the Marines knew that they'd won a good victory, and the Japanese were on the hill. So the best time to make a counterattack is now, you know. So Vandergrift said, look, once and for all, I'm going to wipe these guys off the Matanikau because they're, you know, they've just been beaten heavily. So I'm going to push them back. So on the 1st of November, he took the 5th Marines, and some of the 2nd Marine Regiment had come over from Tulagi this time, so we were going to use them. So the 5th Marines were going to push past the Matanikau to Point Cruz. And then once they reached the Point Cruz area, the 2nd Marine Regiment was going to push past them all the way to Cucumbona, then destroy the 17th Army headquarters and push the Japanese out once and for all. So the attack started quite well. On the 1st of November, the Marine engineers put down 3 footbridges. So they didn't have to use the old coconut log bridge anymore. It's probably fell in by this time because, you know, you'd have thousands of guys over it. But they put 3 engineer bridges down and they crossed. The attack was going quite well, but then the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines hit an area at the base of Point Cruz. And yeah, they got hit pretty hard. And I researched that area quite well because there's still about 23, 24 Marines unaccounted for from that battalion. It was buried on the battlefield. And, you know, when I worked there, my office was basically in the area where all this happened. So I used to think about those guys every day. And to this day, there's still, you know, a lot of remains being found. Because after the war, or after the fighting was over, Guadalcanal became a major logistical and training base. So the battlefield was basically, you know, bulldozed very quickly and concrete slabbed right over to make a base. So a lot of these, I guess, bodies were still left there, remains. Most of them Japanese. But there's been, you know, after the war, they sent teams to try to find them, but they're still unaccounted for, quite a number of them. But anyway, the Marines got hit pretty hard, and they got stopped, and then they sent more reinforcements up, and they basically trapped the Japanese in a pocket and ended up, I think, killing about 350 to 400 Japanese in a pocket. And the 2nd Marines Regiment pushed past them and all the way almost to Cucumbona, a place called White River. And the attack was going quite well. But once again, the Marines received information that the Japanese were making a major landing at Koli Point. Now, Koli Point is to the east of Henderson. Now, you got to remember, Matanikau's to the west, which if I had a map, I'd show you. But we're getting hit potentially on our flank. You know, we need to stop this attack and bring the guys back. And if you remember that 230th Regiment, I was saying it was involved in Battle of Henderson Field. It went parallel and didn't even get into the attack. What they did, they just kept going to the east, and they ended up at Koli Point. So there was at least about 3,000 of those guys there, 4,000. And then they thought they were landing reinforcements, but the Japanese did land reinforcements, landed about 300 or 400 Japanese. So they formed up with this regiment. So you still had a major force to their east. So what they did, they stopped their attack, pulled the guys back, and the poor 7th Marines, you know, who were given a bit of a break, they didn't get much of a break again. They sent them out to deal with them. So they took the 7th Marines and some of the 164th, and they went after the Japanese under General Rupertus. They brought him. He was the assistant division commander. So he was in that operation. And anyway, they tried to trap the Japanese, but especially some of the fresh army units didn't close the gap quick enough, and most of the Japanese escaped out of the swamp at Gavava Creek. They ended up pinning about 450 Japanese or 500, and ended up killing them. And this is the only place where the Marine I mentioned, Chesty Puller, was wounded in 38 years of combat. It was the only place he ever wounded. So I did a video not too long ago on that, on the wounding of Puller, and it covers that area. Not too many people I know even go to that area, not even aware of it. Some of the guys who've been, tour guides have been leading groups of Guadalcanal for years, have never been there. So there's a local chief called what is his name? Not Chief Willie, Chief Joseph. Anyway, his name escapes me. I think it's Joseph. Anyway, he's he actually lives in that area where the Amtraks are. If you go to visit, there's an Amtrak part from the 3rd Marine Division. That was part of their training camp after the campaign. Because once again they trained there at the 3rd Marine Division. In fact, the 6th Marine Division was actually born in Guadalcanal in 1944. But anyway, there's Amtrak parts there. They left all their amphibious tractors there, and it's a good place. A lot of people go visit. We speak to Chief Joseph. A lot of these guys, if you ever go visit the Amtrak parts, he's got a big pit there. It's called the Japanese are buried in it. And then to this day, and his hut's right there in front of it. To this day, he refuses the Japanese government from digging them up and cremating the bones. Because his grandfather was Jacob Vuza, who was the most famous Guadalcanal, very famous scout for the Americans. If you ever read about Guadalcanal Campaign, you know about Vuza, but Vuza was his grandfather, and Vuza basically told him, he says, leave those Japanese there. He says, never, they're not worth it. And he says, any Americans, yeah, dig them up and give them back. The Japanese can stay there. But, once again, that was in the times. And if you ever read what the Japanese soldiers did to Jacob Vuza, you'd probably understand his way of thinking. But he's, going to his grandfather's wishes. But once again, he kind of looks after them. They're all in the same area, so no one disturbed them. So I guess you could look at it that way. But so Balakoli Point, they escaped out, and when they escaped, a couple of thousand, I think, escaped. I have to know the exact number off the top of my head. All this has come off the top of my head. The 2nd Marine Raiders under Carlson had landed at Aola, which is down further on the East Coast. And Ed came up at the time, and this is the famous, especially in special operations history, this is known as the Long Patrol, the 30-day Long Patrol by the 2nd Raiders. So what they were tasked to do, because the Japanese were moving back around Mount Austen to join their group around Matanikau. So Edson was given a task to follow these guys and harass them. Good guerrilla techniques that these guys are trained to do. So they did. For 30 days, they harassed this group. And they ended up killing quite a number of them. But saying that a lot of them were like dying by the roadside or in hospitals and things like that from disease and starvation. But ended up, I'd say killing what 500 or 600, I think the Raiders did. They basically decimated them, what was left of them, losing about 16 Raiders. But that was known as the Long Patrol, very famous patrol, special operations history with the Raiders. So
yeah, I think like 800 survivors of the Japanese ended up getting out. The rest were, they had starved and gone through the ringer with disease and everything. It was a rough time.
Yeah, I mean, you read what the Japanese did. Yeah, wow. Marines at the first of the campaign said, look, I think one of them said, look, we're not eating much, but we're not starving. The Japanese are starving. They're starving. We're not starving. We're not eating much, but they really are starving because they were. I think the Japanese, the counts differ, but I think we never get an accurate count. But over 20,000 Japanese died on land there. 9,000 died from combat, roughly. And so the rest of them died from starvation and disease, just to put it in perspective.
Yeah, crazy. I think, if I remember correctly, because I was writing a little piece on this, there was a veteran of Guadalcanal from Japan. I think his name was Sadio Suzuki, and he was the guy who kind of came up with the name Death Island by Starvation.
Yeah. Starvation Island, they call
Yeah,
it.
Starvation Island.
Death Island, Island of Death. The locals at the time called it the Big Death. That's what they known as the battles between the Americans and the Japanese. They call it the Big Death. That's the time they refer to as World War II, the Big Death. Crazy. All right, so it takes us up to mid-November now. So Koli point's over with. So Vandegrift says, look, I'm going to give it one last shot. We'll continue our offensive in November. So they recommenced their mid-November, their offensive. And they started fighting. They got in. You can remember by this time, the 1st Marine Division was spent, from their own malaria and diseases and just being there for almost 4 months. They didn't have much offensive spirit left, so to speak. Excuse me. So the army started bringing more units in to reinforce Marines. So they brought another regiment in, the Matanikau Division, to assist. So they used some of those guys, and then they got up to Point Cruz line, and they suffered a bit of a setback, and the Japanese had dug in, and the U.S. dug in. So from late November all the way till, I'd say, January, that Point Cruz line became the front line. And a lot of people who read about the Guadalcanal Campaign don't even realize this. The most intensive fighting in the Guadalcanal Campaign happened around the Matanikau and the Point Cruz area. People tend to think Bloody Ridge and Alligator Creek, but no, the most intensive fighting was around that area, Matanikau and Point Cruz.
Honestly, from a lot of the limited readings, it's almost as if after Bloody Ridge, they summarized most of the other actions that happened after. Yeah,
it was a lot of action happening.
Yeah.
So we almost there to the Army's major involvement. So they were stuck there late November, starting to be early December. So the Marines started moving out, and the Army mainly started coming in. So around early December, the first of the Marines started moving out of the 1st Marine Division. By the end of December, all the 1st Marine Division had left for R&R, so to speak, in Australia. And there's those poor guys. 80% of the division had the malaria and were so decimated. So it took them almost a whole year to get back so they could carry on another operation. So they left a well-deserved rest. And the more elements of the 2nd Marine Division, because many don't even know the 2nd Marine Division was actually on Guadalcanal, but by January, they're on Guadalcanal in entirety. Because before you had the 2nd Marine Regiment was there, they didn't get to leave in December with the rest of them, so they had to stay the whole course. But then 6th Marine Regiment and the 8th Marine Regiment had came in, so they started coming in too. And the U.S. Army, they started getting the rest of the Matanikau Division, and they started bringing the 25th Infantry Division. These are guys that were stationed at Hawaii around Schofield Barracks on Pearl Harbor. So, they were the regulars, so to speak, the regular units, even though they did have a National Guard regiment, but they was the regulars with the 27th and the 35th Regiment. So they were landed, and Vandegrift turned over the command to a guy called Alexander Patch, Major General. So he's U.S. Army. So he was the division commander. Then he was elevated they formed the Corps. Then it's the 14th Corps. So they formed the 14th Corps, which had the Matanikau Division, the 25th Division, and the 2nd Marine Division. So what Patch decided to do, he says, look, we're going to go on the offensive. He was giving the orders to destroy these Japanese once and for all. So the Japanese, I'll backtrack a bit. In mid-November, they were going to they were going to replicate the attack they did in October. They had the rest of the 38th Division. They were going to land them. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to take the battleships. They're going to blast Henderson Field. They're going to unload all the heavy artillery, and then they were going to do another attack.
Yeah, so this time they're bringing the Heiwa and the Kirishima. It's this is the naval battle of Guadalcanal.
So the mid-naval battles of Guadalcanal there, it fought, I think 13th to the 17th, something like that. That's when you had the battleship on battleship action, and it's just amazing the naval battles around Guadalcanal, the most intense probably anywhere in a war of surface fleet action, to that extent, especially for the U.S. Navy. But yeah, that's another sidetrack, and that was some major, massive battle, especially that naval battle. And on that, I think which video it is. It's called the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal and the American Monument. So you stand there, and I'm showing them a video between one point and another point. You know, you have 30 ships meeting at night, all in a line, and it was, you know, that was the one where it was equated to like a ballroom brawl with the lights turned out. It was
Oh
just
my God, yes.
guys are shooting each other
Searchlights.
200
Yeah.
yard machine guns. Yeah, machine guns.
Searchlights come on, people are shooting. Even the Americans are friendly fires going on. It was a
Oh
barroom
yeah, you
fight.
know, you got destroyers on these battleships. You know, they can't depress their guns enough. It's just bloody amazing if you read it. But anyway, they stopped them, and so the Japanese basically went on the defensive then. But they went on the defensive, ready to go back on the offensive again. They had their whole offensive, you know, frame of mind. So what they'd done at Mount Austen, you know, it was the bloody or the grassy knoll. It overlooks to this day. You know, it looks the same as it did. It overlooks Henderson Field, and there's always Marines always knew they'd been on observation, but they didn't have enough guys really to take it out. It's kind of live and let live. But Alexander Patch said, look, we want to take, we knew there was some Japanese. He thought there's maybe like a company of Japanese demoralized up there. And he said, I'll send a battalion of one of my fresh units to take them out. And at the same time, there were some Japanese infiltrating off Mount Austen and going in Henderson Field and doing nighttime raids. So he said, we'll end this. He says, I want to push down the West Coast, but I always have these guys on my flank. So I want to take out my flank to allow me to push down the West Coast. So what he did, he sent the 132nd Battalion of 132nd Regiment, which is a National Guard unit. He sent them up just to take care of them, just to say, look, you know, go up and eliminate that threat. So they advanced up, and they got hit pretty hard with machine gun fire. And they go, these guys are not demoralized. And then they lost their battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Wright, which to this day, there's a road up there called the Wright Road. And at that stage, it was just a jeep trail, and it ended, and it became just a trail. What the Japanese had done, it had almost a regiment dug in, or two battalions dug in, and they had a horseshoe-shaped line with about 45 coconut pillboxes. It was a horseshoe shape, and to the west was the Matanikau River, is a straight cliff, so the Americans really couldn't penetrate that line. So the Americans sent another battalion up, and they kept trying to flank it, and they kept getting hit. Because if you go there, the Japanese, it's very thick jungle, and they had well camouflaged bunkers. And the reports that the soldiers are only getting, you know, 5-10 feet from these bunkers, not even seeing them, and they're opening up on them. It's very scary. So anyway, they couldn't flank them, so they dug in too. So most of December, they were dug in. They were just facing each other, taking casualties. And the rest of the 25th Division landed. So the U.S. Army said, okay, the 10th of January will be our main offensive. So on the 10th of January, they're going to, 2nd Marine Division was going to attack down the coast. The 25th Division took over. The 25th Division was going to take Mount Austen, and it was called the Gifu, by the way. I forgot to mention that. The Japanese named it the Gifu. That was named after a local area where most of these soldiers came from, the Gifu. And they were going to isolate the Gifu. And they had to isolate the Gifu. There was a number of ridges to the west of the Gifu and across Matanikau. And if you ever see the movies, there's an old one and a new one called The Thin Red Line, and read the book, The Thin Red Line. You know, even though it's a fictional account, it's based on this account of these attacks by the 25th on these ridges to isolate. So I've got a good video. And that area is called the Thin Red Line. It's the galloping horse. So if you look at a topographical map, you turn it upside down, it looks like a horse galloping to this day, you know, from the coral ridges, open ridges in the jungles. And nearby is a seahorse, looks like a seahorse. So they were given a task isolating and destroying the Japanese who were dug in those hills. And even the movie, The Thin Red Line, the modern one, with, you know, with Tom Cruise and Nick Nolte and Cusack and the rest of them, the terrain looks quite very similar how it looks in reality. You see my video, it is the most perfectly observed battlefield on Guadalcanal, because it's just hard to get to, isolated. They did film in that movie. They did film parts of Guadalcanal. Most of it was filmed in northern Queensland in Australia, But there's a part of the movie in the very beginning, I think they're walking up a slope. You can see Mount or Savo Island in the background. So that was filmed on Guadalcanal. And some of the singing in the movies, it's a long movie, so like I said, I won't get into what I actually think of the movie, but the combat scenes are pretty good, and especially when it depicts John Cusack taking those bunkers. That's loosely based on a fellow named Captain Charles Davis, who actually earned a Medal of Honor up top there. So, and my video talked about that, and it's quite amazing. There's one, I think I was telling you this story before. There's one part there that I think is super amazing. When I was researching it and I was up on the battlefield, and I found the two big bunker holes that the Japanese pillboxes that they took out was on the reverse slope. And I knew that Davis and 4 other guys had crawled up within 10 yards, and they were supposed to distract the Japanese, and then a battalion commander with the company was going to come over to Coral Edge and attack. And when he distracted, he's going to blow a whistle. So what happened was, before they did that, they got within 10 yards, and I'm crawling. I'm doing the same thing. I'm crawling. I'm going, oh, this is where he would have been. Okay, I can see where the bunkers are. And then I knew that the Japanese threw some grenades at them, and it didn't explode. But so Davis and his other army guys, the soldiers, threw their grenades, and it exploded, and they jumped up. Davis led the charge with his Garand, and then I think it went had a stoppage on his Garand, and he transitioned to his pistol, I think, or maybe vice versa. But anyway, I'm looking at, okay, they were here, they did this, and I'm looking down on the Carl, and there's pool pins from hand grenades all scattered around me. And I thought, well, this can't be. But then I started thinking, hold on a minute, this battle was never fought over anyway. This is the only time this place was ever fought on. There wasn't no one trained on this area. It has to be these guys pool pins from their grenades. Just amazing that potentially it was from a Medal of Honor action that just sitting on top of the ground. Just crazy, because it doesn't go down the ground. It's all Carl. So yeah, so they end up taking that, and they took the Seahorse, and so they isolated the Gifu. And they knew by isolating the Gifu, the Japanese couldn't get reinforced supplies from that flank. So I think in the next day or day after, the rest of the 35th, after a major bombardment, attacked the Japanese bunkers on the Gifu, and they had 3 tanks, Marine tanks that they'd borrowed, and they had, or Marines probably left, had Army drivers, and they only got 1 tank in position, but that 1 tank was enough to take out the bunkers. Because you got to remember, this is before the days of flamethrowers, and those Army National Guard guys only had hand grenades and rifles and bayonets to take out these bunkers. So it was pretty hard work, but the tank kind of made the difference. So the Japanese, after their back was broken there, so to speak, they did a small banzai charge, and it was destroyed. So that basically, that threat was eliminated. So, and the rest of January, the Army and the Marines, 2nd Marine Division, started pushing down the coast. And they were fighting in isolated Japanese, but the Japanese is basically their offensive spirit or defense, they were basically destroyed, and they didn't have much fight left in them. Around the last of December, I think the last day of December, the Japanese High Command basically made the decision that we will evacuate Guadalcanal. But the Japanese thought, how can we do this? And they had to have a big intelligence, I guess, fight for the Americans, to try to fool the Americans by using intelligence. So what the Japanese did, they made it look like for the Americans to assume that the Japanese were going to do another large offensive on Guadalcanal. The Americans thought, okay, the Japanese were going to do another large offensive. They're not giving it up. So the Japanese ended up landing a fresh battalion. They did of troops, but they were going to be the rear guard just to provide cover for the rest of the guys to move out. So the Army and the Marines fought a series of small engagements, mainly on the creeks and rivers, leading to the very end of the northwest part of Guadalcanal, called Cape Esperance, around that area. And the Japanese would basically leave guys to die, or the rear guard at each creek or each river, to die in place just to hold them back. And there's Operation Key, I think it's called Key. And over a series of nights, the Japanese evacuated on, I think, 9 to 11,000. Probably never find the exact numbers.
Yeah,
Over,
it's almost 11,000. It's kind of like they're Dunkirk, basically.
yeah, and it was like you mentioning that it's like the Gallipoli campaign in World War One. You know, with the
Yeah,
Australians
exactly.
and the
Yeah.
British. You know, the most successful part of the campaign is evacuations. You could probably say the same here with the Japanese, and it's probably the only real island they evacuated in the whole Pacific. You know, because
Yeah,
once
it really
again,
honestly is. Mm.
after Guadalcanal, you know, they didn't have the capacity to do it. I think they didn't control the sea lanes,
I
and
don't think they had the luxury. Yeah.
yeah, you know, they would have been sunk. And mention that, you know, Guadalcanal is probably the only time in the Pacific War where both forces were on par, so to speak. They're both equal, roughly equal. I mean, in the very beginning of the war, Japanese had the kind of upper hand, and obviously toward the end of the war, you know, the Allies basically, you know, they could dominate anywhere they wanted with the mass material and technology and firepower. But here, the forces were evenly matched. And in saying that, once the Allies defeated the Japanese in Guadalcanal, it really gave them a major boost. You know, they had small wins elsewhere in the Pacific, but only at Guadalcanal and nearby Bunagona and Kokoda that it really said, look, we fought the best the Japanese have, and especially at Guadalcanal, we fought the best the Japanese had on air, sea, and land.
I think
And
for a lot of people who are less knowledgeable about the Pacific War, they always tend to look at, you know, and I think it's just because of the title. The Battle of Midway is almost always portrayed as this kind of turning point, but a lot of people would argue it's honestly it's Guadalcanal, because it's when the Japanese actually had to go on the defensive foot afterwards.
yeah, well, I agree. I'm one of those who would say yes, you're correct, because you know, what's a turning point? I mean, I think a turning point is when the strategic initiative is a shift in the strategic initiative of a war. And after Midway, you didn't see a shift in strategic initiative because the Japanese are still on the offensive.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. It
especially
was a
in the
bloody
South
nose.
Pacific.
It's a bloody nose, but the Japanese Navy was still the strongest at that point. They're still numerous, and they
Oh
still
yeah.
controlled the territories. I mean,
Mm.
honestly, when it came to the naval aspect of Guadalcanal, it was in their pockets. They had the poker chips, but they didn't have the intelligence. Station Hypno and the crypto analysts, they were learning from them and breaking the codes, and that numbers didn't win out against the intelligence. The Japanese, they had the better poker hand, but the Americans knew where they were going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And Midway gave the Allies it gave them the momentum, I guess you could say. You go
Big
before they
morale
were still,
boost, yeah.
yeah, just like we spoke about in the last episode, they were Special Admiral King, the head of the chief naval operations, he'd already had it in his mind that, you know, even though it was a Europe first, he was still pushing for take the offensive at some point
Yeah.
in the Pacific, and he wanted to log in the surrounding islands, you know, and that was even before Midway. Then once Midway happened, he said, okay, now we're going to, you know, accelerate this plan, and it
It's
did
actually
accelerate their plan.
it's actually kind of funny because he was going to be going to FDR with a proposal to get more resources for the Pacific, and it was the Battle of Midway that actually shifted FDR to say yes.
Yeah, so yeah, it actually, you know, it brought everything forward a bit.
Yeah.
So I would say Guadalcanal, in conjunction with the Papua New Guinea campaign, it was happening at the same time as Guadalcanal, because Papua New Guinea with the Australians and Americans, you know, some people don't even know the Americans were there, but the 32nd Division was there. And you know, when they won at Bunagona, which is the northern end, the northern part there, so their campaign ended in January 43, and the Guadalcanal was February 43. So I call it the 1-2 punch. Between those two, you know, that shifted the strategic focus, strategic initiative. Because, you know, before Guadalcanal, the Japanese had the initiative. After Guadalcanal, it was clear they didn't have the initiative.
It was
And
actually
then the Japanese High
particularly
Command says that. Yep. Go ahead.
it was particularly important for the Japanese because the commanders who were in New Guinea, they were under the influence the entire time they had to do any of the strategic planning. It was under the presumption that at any single moment, Guadalcanal could fall and all the units in Guadalcanal could come over to New Guinea. So it completely affected everything they did. And when it fell, yeah, of course, it really crippled New Guinea. It was like the nail in the coffin for both. The 1-2
Well,
punch,
it's
like
been
you
a
said.
what if, you know, Port Moresby was their main objective. And,
Yeah.
Almost 40,000, 30 to 40,000 Japanese were put on land on Guadalcanal. It's a big what if. What if, they would have went to, Port Moresby and New Guinea instead, which a lot of them, like the 35th Brigade was supposed to go to New Guinea. And the 2nd was supposed to go to New Guinea, as far as I know. So, you put all those, how would that been turned out?
How would Australia react? Prime Minister and Churchill weren't seeing eye to eye on a lot of things too. There's I mean, I know that there's a lot of arguments to be made that Australia was never even considering suing for peace or anything, but you never know.
There's a good chance Port Moresby probably would have fell, because all the reinforcements and supplies that Guadalcanal took it away from that campaign and refocused their shift, because Japanese couldn't maintain two, strategic important campaigns at the same time. So that's when they put one on hold in September after Bloody Ridge, which was the Papua New Guinea, Kokoda. And Kokoda, I'm obviously not the expert on Kokoda, but I know enough that they started bringing the regular forces over, because the militia guys did a great job holding them off. But then the regular forces landed. They brought them over to 7th Infantry Division. And they started fighting back, and it allowed them a chance to get a bit of a fight back. Give them a bit of a breather to consolidate the forces and push the Japanese back over. So to me, those two campaigns are the turning point. And but there's a whole number of turning points you could say. It's probably not just one, but I think that was when the Japanese really knew that, okay. And I think one Japanese general basically said, after Guadalcanal, I knew that it was over with.
Yes. Yes. It's famous.
And the Solomon Islands decimated, people talk about Midway, destroyed the Japanese air. It didn't destroy the Japanese air crews. Not that many went down. I think we were discussing the other day, Battle of Santa Cruz in that October. I think more Japanese lost more air crews than Midway. I don't know. I have to double check that. But
it was up to
it was definitely
a large number. It was almost 500.
Yeah, it was definitely the Solomon Islands campaign that destroyed their air power. I mean,
and they can't replace them. The training for the Americans could train pilots and put them out, and they had veteran pilots coming back and training other Americans. But for the Japanese, that was a huge problem for them. They actually mistreated their veteran pilots. It's interesting.
Yeah, they used them till they just died. Well, this is and I think it was almost 700 Japanese planes were lost in the Guadalcanal campaign.
Yeah, all the veteran pilots who came back from Midway were scorned for it, and they were the guys they were still the veterans of some of them of Pearl Harbor and stuff, and they had knowledge to bring down to the other pilots coming up, and they were not allowed. They were actually sporadically kind of spread out across different regions and stuff. It's really weird how the Japanese went about that, but they can never rebuild what they had come into the war with.
Yeah, well, that probably wraps up all I have to really say. Unless we got any questions or something. I've been talking for a bit. And once again, Guadalcanal, you could go down many rabbit holes, and you could do a whole series just on Guadalcanal itself. I mean, it's the very first time in world history, military history, that you had such a large naval, air, and sea campaign going at the same time.
I guess
you won't find many parts of World War II like that, not in this intense, small area.
An interesting way to finish this off. I think I would like to ask you, since you've been on Guadalcanal for so long, what was your favorite battlefield to walk? What was the most interesting, or where you felt something?
I'd say the Galloping Horse. The one I mentioned is probably the best preserved. And if you look at my video, you will see that it's just like it was there. I mean, it's just amazing, and it's a great study on how water or lack of water could decimate a unit. Because those guys up there, they didn't get any water supply. They had one canteen of water, and it's just, when you're up there yourself and you've got to get up to that area, and once you even get to the battlefield, you feel like you're half dead, because you got to go straight up this mountain. And once you get up there, and it's like, I've seen a number of you have to be, if you go to Guadalcanal, you got to be very acclimatized. I don't know if you can actually do that. Most people, when they get to the top of the thing, they vomit. Just a natural reaction. Well, they get their vomit, then they'll continue on. Okay, let's get some water in you. Let's continue on. But and those poor guys, it attacked. They're only on the island for maybe 2 weeks, and they had one canteen of water. And let's tack up these ridges, and Japanese dropping mortars and machine guns, and you're sprinting and running, and and at the end of the night, they're green troops too, so water discipline would have been off. And when the nighttime come, they didn't get resupplied because guys couldn't get up to them. And the next morning, they had to kick off their next attack, and they had so many heat casualties already. And once they received a bit of machine gun fire, they just stopped their battalion and stopped its attacking its track, and as they were done for. They had to bring another battalion up, and then when they brought the second battalion up, they actually ran out of water too. It was a big thunderstorm that came through, and it gave them a little bit of water to quench their thirst, enough to get them over the edge, so to speak, and take the rest of it. But yeah, that's my favorite battlefield. You can really study. I like Bloody Ridge too. I used to go to Bloody Ridge all the time. From work, I used to drive up. I calculate I've been to Bloody Ridge over 300 times. Wow. I mean, I can close my eyes and I can, if I look at it, just a little bit of a picture of Bloody Ridge, of a photo, someone says, "Oh, where's this at?" From 1942, 43. I could probably, most can pick it out quite quickly because I know that terrain quite well. That's a great battlefield to study too, because I've taken when I was there, Marines, Australian, New Zealand, Army, NCOs and officers for battlefield study groups, and we really study the Battle of Bloody Ridge. It's a good one to study. Really but there's quite a number. But I used to go to Bloody Ridge, and it's a very peaceful place. The only place on Guadalcanal that I ever get that kind of heebie-jeebies, or the hair stand out the back of your neck, was Coffin Corner. It's the only place in the thick jungle I'm walking. I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. There's someone around here. It just it just doesn't feel right. Bloody Ridge is very peaceful. Coffin Corner, but once again, the burial pits for the Japanese, each burial pit, held 400 or 500 Japanese. There's about 3 big burial pits there. Held 1,500 Japanese dead, and they've been excavated in the 80s, but the burial pits are there, and they still find equipment and bits and pieces there all the time, and and there's bones everywhere. So and unexploded ordnance is a big problem right now in the Solomon Islands. It's everywhere.
So to finish it off, how about you just tell the audience again where they can find you? Where can they watch these amazing videos of you walking the battlefield and giving these tours?
Yeah, so it's a YouTube page. It's called Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield, and then I have a Facebook page called Guadalcanal Walking a Battlefield. And my Guadalcanal YouTube one, it has a lot of videos for me actually on the battlefield, but then I've got 4 or 5 here recently because I haven't been back to Guadalcanal, especially with COVID. I'm planning on hopefully going back into this year, definitely next year, and filming some more. But in the meantime, I'm just doing some small episodes that's got then and now photos and off the beaten track, like the projected puller wounding and a few things. And once again, my Facebook page updated 1 or 2 days, every 1 or 2 days with fresh material that hopefully you've never seen before. So that's it.
So everyone, please show him some love. Check out his videos, like and subscribe. And Dave, it's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, Craig, thanks for having me on, mate. It's always, oh, sorry, mate, that's my Australian in me, buddy. Thanks for having me, and I'm eager to talk anything about Guadalcanal.
Absolutely. It's been the Pacific War Podcast, week by week, over and out.